Welcome, everyone. It's a joy to have you here for this Monday program at 4 o'clock. The future of Elmhurst College's work in the Holocaust studies with a commanding group of commentators and also a wonderful guest. As some of you know, we chose this day because it's the 9th of November. You should know that date because it's the anniversary of Kristallnacht. 82 years ago, the night of broken glass came into all of Germany and destroyed well over 250 synagogues and businesses. And it is, in some scholars' understanding, this night is the beginning of the Holocaust. So we wanted to gather today and to bring together a group of folks, and we're so thankful that you are here to join us. We are taping this gathering so that it can be used in the future. And as you know, Elmhurst has been involved in well over 30 years of study and trips overseas, up to Skokie and to the Washington, D.C. Holocaust Museum. This conversation is a part of what we want to do to help you and all of our community grow together. And to help us with that day today, as your chaplain, I'm honored to always be around some of these great folks that are here that are part of our life. Rabbi Steven Bob is a founding member of the Holocaust work at the college, now university. He is on the faculty. He serves as our Jewish chaplain. He's a dear friend and been deeply involved in the entire life of the college. Joining him is one of our wonderful professors, Professor Mary Kay Mulvaney. She is out of the English department. She is also the chair of our honors program and has been the runner of that, the director, for many years. She took the first delegation with me to Washington, D.C., to the National Museums. And in that first trip was this wonderful undergraduate by the name of Michelle Sadowski. Michelle graduated and she's now working with us in the Niebuhr Center. And she has gone on to do master's studies and is a docent in the work up at the Skokie Museum and the Holocaust team there in our Illinois Holocaust Museum. These three individuals have been invited to be in a conversation with someone that we had hoped to host on campus, but because of COVID, we weren't allowed to bring her here. So this is the best we can do, but it's wonderful that I have the joy of welcoming Dr. Rebecca Carter-Todd, who is originally from Canada and has her Ph.D. in Canada from the University of Toronto, and has joined through a number of academic circles into the national staff of our Holocaust Museum in DC. And she sits in particular as a program officer and now the acting director of the program on ethics, religion, and Holocaust work. She has had many conversations with us, and she looks forward to hosting us when we can come back to DC. But we wanted to begin this time with inviting Dr. Carter-Todd to offer a few minutes of reflections on the future, and that would lead into Professor Mulvaney, Michelle, and then Rabbi Bob offering commentary. And then we would then invite you all to type questions down there in the box and get us going in questions and answers. We have about a 45-minute time for rich conversation and imagination and thinking about, and to remember what today is. Kristallnacht, the day of broken glass, the night of broken glass. So in all the ways that you come here today, I'm so thankful that you're here, and especially, Doctor, we are so thankful that you're with us. Rebecca, please, welcome to the college, university, and to our conversations. Thank you so much for joining us, please.
Thank you so much, Scott, and thanks for having me. It's true, we've been having these discussions now for at least a year, and we had hoped that I could come and see you in person, and I hope that will be possible someday. But in the meantime, I think we've all gotten used to Zoom and these sorts of meetings, and so we can just jump right in and have what I'm sure will be a really great conversation today. So I thought that I would just start us off and maybe spark some thoughts among the other panelists and the audience members for a conversation. But I thought I'd start by describing my work at the Holocaust Museum in Washington and highlight some of our approach to our work and some potential directions for Holocaust education at Elmhurst University. So I work in the programs on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust, which is housed in the academic wing of the museum in the Mandel Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies. And we have sort of a unique role at the museum. You know, we say we work with different audiences, academic audiences, and also with religious communities and religious leaders. You know, the Holocaust really raises profound theological, ethical, and historical questions for people of all faiths. You know, how could the Holocaust have happened in the so-called heart of Christian Europe? Can one continue to believe in God in the face of such evil? What ought to be the role of clergy or religious leaders in times of political fracture and war and genocide? Were people of faith motivated to rescue Jews during the Holocaust because of their religious convictions? You know, so the role of the Christian churches in particular and the legacy of centuries-long anti-Semitism encompasses, I think, a particularly sensitive and complex set of issues. And so since its founding, the Holocaust Museum has offered programming and resources that focus on the history of the Christian churches and their responses to the Holocaust and the ways in which religious institutions and theologians and leaders have, you know, dealt with this difficult history since the end of World War II. In the early years, so the 1980s and 1990s, this topic, the role of the churches in the Holocaust and history of anti-Semitism, was much more polemical and not always well understood. And if you go on our website, you can watch a 12-minute video on the history of anti-Semitism and see this film, which I think is not very controversial in 2020, was the source of a lot of you know, criticism and debate, you know, 20, 30 years ago. And so the museum established a church relations committee of scholars and religious leaders to serve as a resource and a bridge, really, to help this understanding. In 2012, we changed our name to the programs on ethics, religion, and the Holocaust to reflect the fact that we work with a much broader range of religious communities than just churches, as well as interreligious groups. And so we talk a lot about how Christian denominations have taken a hard look at their teachings, and as well as liturgies and symbols regarding Jews and Judaism, and have engaged in, I think, very productive interfaith dialogues. And so in my office, we're working with researchers and academics, but also professors who are teaching these subjects, and religious leaders and community groups who are coming to the Holocaust Museum to learn and reflect on this history. So that's just a bit of my work in a nutshell. And I wanted to speak about a few different things. The first is the importance of religious literacy, because I know that engagement with Holocaust studies at Elmhurst College, now university, has historically been through the chaplain's office. And I think this is fantastic. I think it's not every campus has it set up this way, but I think that it is really good, especially given what I've been hearing and learning about your institution's history. With your German and Lutheran tradition of the school, I think it is important to view the Holocaust through your own tradition, even though I understand your student body and faculty and staff are very much very diverse these days. You still have this institutional history that you've inherited. And I think religious literacy is very important to understanding the Holocaust. And so I think it's really great that you have these chaplains who are working alongside faculty and students to be doing Holocaust programming. You know, and another thing we talk about a lot, I think is a fantastic resource, is from the American Academy of Religion. Maybe some of you are familiar with this, but in 2019, they issued a religious literacy guidelines, what every US college graduate needs to understand about religion. You can find this on their website of the AAR. And they start with this notion that religions are culturally and historically embedded in virtually all dimensions of the human experience, and that understanding these religious dimensions requires some religious literacy. They define this term, religious literacy, with this, and I quote, "Religious literacy includes the ability to discern and analyze the role of religion in personal, social, political, professional, and cultural life." And so I would say that it's important for everyone learning about the Holocaust to have some religious literacy, regardless of their own religious identity or lack thereof. Another place that I turn to a lot that I find very helpful and trustworthy is the Pew Research Group surveys. You might be familiar with their surveys. They do on a number of topics, but in 2019, they asked Americans a fact-based, multiple choice survey of questions about world religions. So this is, what do Americans understand about religion? And, you can easily pull this report up on their website, but it says that most Americans correctly answer basic questions about Christianity, atheism, and Islam, but fewer know about Judaism, Hinduism, or what the Constitution says about religion. I just throw that out as a few examples. But, they found that 3 in 10 or fewer Americans know when the Jewish Sabbath begins, or that Rosh Hashanah is the Jewish New Year. And I think this is important for those of us who are engaged in Holocaust studies, because, a lack of religious literacy has an important consequences for how people engage with this history, for really understanding some fundamental dynamics about anti-Semitism, about the role of the churches, and about Jewish religious responses to the Holocaust. So that's sort of my first point, is about religious literacy. And the next has to do with multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches to the Holocaust. There have been some recent surveys on Holocaust knowledge, especially among young people, among students, and they suggest some alarming, statistics about the lack of knowledge. There was a famous one from the Claims Conference in 2018, followed up by, they did another one on Canada the next year, which sort of had somewhat similar results. But, I do want to caution us and say that we have to interrogate these surveys and ask, what, as Holocaust educators, what our goal is. And then you have to ask questions, that you want answers to, right, when you're designing a survey. And so I actually like another survey that the Pew Research Center did just this year. So this came out in January 2020, about what Americans know about the Holocaust. And in many ways that I don't have time to get into, I think that it is sort of a better study. But I guess my point is that, some of these questions that seem quite shocking, like a certain percentage of people don't know what Auschwitz is, or how many Jews were killed in the Holocaust. These are somewhat misleading because of the way the question was asked, and we have to ask ourselves, what do we want people to learn from Holocaust education, and what is the point of it? Speaking as a person who is trained as a historian, of course, I support in-depth study of the Holocaust, whole courses devoted to Holocaust history. And if your history department or your campus can support it, multiple courses on the Holocaust. But not every campus, not every school, especially in this day and age, is able to offer courses, or maybe they can't offer it every year. And so my colleagues and I at the museum are focusing a lot these days on how we can integrate Holocaust content, the study of the Holocaust or different aspects of it, into different courses. Maybe it's not a whole course devoted to the Holocaust. Maybe it is something more broadly, into courses on medical ethics or US foreign policy or theology in the 20th century, law courses, literature, art courses. There are so many ways to integrate this. And I think that the more that these different courses and these different perspectives are in conversation with each other on campus, the richer that the education will be. And so that does require some coordination on the part of someone on campus. And it also requires some people who maybe are not trained in Holocaust history to be able to have the tools and feel, comfortable enough incorporating aspects of this history into their courses if they are, in a completely different field. And that's some of what my colleagues in the Mandel Center in the campus outreach program have been working with people from very, very different fields, bringing them into, not trying to turn them into Holocaust studies scholars, but give them the tools to integrate this into their courses. I want to move on. I do have a couple examples of how I'm doing that in my program. We just had a fantastic symposium on the newly opened Vatican archives, in which we had, people from history, theology, but also diplomacy and law and Jewish-Christian relations. We have an upcoming workshop that we're just starting to plan on sacred objects from the Holocaust. And this brings together history, religious studies, but also people who are professional conservators and curators and bringing them into conversation. But I'm aware of the time, so I'm going to move on to my next point, which is how learning and reflection, and please, Scott, just sort of wave at me if you want me to wrap it up. But okay, so learning and reflection being so tied together. For many people, probably most people, learning about the Holocaust is not simply an academic exercise. They want to come to terms with the past, perhaps, or they want to draw lessons from the past. But in order to draw lessons from the past, one must first learn what happened and appreciate the complexity of people's actions and decisions at the time. And so that's why we focus on the history. It's crucial that we not skip this part. But students especially want to go beyond this and learn how it relates to other things they're learning in other courses, how they understand the world, perhaps advocacy work that they can do in today's world. Another thing that I appreciate about this report that the AAR released last year on religious literacy is they outline a number of different approaches to religious studying religion in a university environment. And they advocate for an academic religious studies approach, but they also talk about a faith-sensitive approach. And I really like that, because this is saying that, we allow our participants to voluntarily reflect on their own religious traditions and incorporate what they're learning into their own faith commitments. So for instance, when I do programming at the museum, and I understand that some people are coming to this with their own religious identity, they're going to be learning and processing things through their own, through that lens, through their own faith, and that is perfectly fine. Of course, it's not my place to sort of advocate for a particular theological position, but just be sensitive to the fact that people are doing that on their own, and that is a perfectly good thing to happen. And so I think the trips that you all have been doing to the museum have been really important. And I think the stories that I just heard this afternoon before we started the call are evidence of that. But I guess, at least during this COVID time, we do have to be thinking about alternatives to travel. And so I'd be happy to brainstorm a bit with you about other things that you can do, perhaps in this interim time when you're not able to travel. I think there are lots of other options. And the final thing that I wanted to say, this is my final point, is, and this is so important to the way that I approach this history, especially in looking at religious actors, is moving beyond heroes and villains. Because people so often approach the history of Nazi Germany and the Holocaust in very black and white terms, seeing only villains and heroes. You see perpetrators, victims, bystanders, rescuers. And it's really valuable to show the complexity of the history and show how religious leaders and people of faith were motivated by more than just their religious beliefs. They were, fully within their own political, social, cultural context. And sometimes we learn about how people gave assistance to others for reasons that were not so altruistic. Sometimes people in the past who were very committed to justice and advocacy and dialogue in some areas were, had their blind spots or their prejudices. My own work on studying the Salvation Army in Nazi Germany is a case in point. We also learned that people change over time. And though we might be tempted to hold them up as heroes, it's actually more instructive to see them as flawed human beings. And here I just wanted to close with this specific example of Martin Niemöller, Pastor Martin Niemöller, who many of you might be familiar with, and his very famous but misunderstood poetic confession, which actually ends the permanent exhibition at the Holocaust Museum. First, they came for the communists, and I did not speak out because I was not a communist. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak out because I was not a trade unionist. Then they came for the Jews, and I did not speak out because I was not a Jew. And then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. So Martin Niemöller was a leading Protestant pastor, leader of the Confessing Church in Nazi Germany, who became an outspoken opponent of Hitler and spent the last 7 years of Nazi rule in concentration camps. This sort of poem or confession, as I just read it to you, only came into existence or gradually in the post-war years. And they really are, a lot of people find them inspiring, and they do challenge us to confront our action or inaction vis-a-vis others. But many people are surprised to learn that Niemöller was an ardent German nationalist. He harbored typical anti-Jewish stereotypes of his day, and he even voted for the Nazi Party twice, in 1924 and again in 1933. There's a great new biography of Martin Niemöller by my friend Matthew Hokenas called Then They Came for Me. And in this book, he describes this moment of Martin Niemöller and his wife visiting Dachau shortly after the end of the war. So he had been imprisoned at Dachau during the war. And it was only after he went back and visited and started to understand the magnitude and the sheer size of the Nazi destruction and the Holocaust. And, he said, my alibi accounted for the years 1937 to 1945. Those were the years where he himself was imprisoned. But then he went on and said, but God was not asking me in that moment where I had been from 1937 to 1945, but from 1933 to 1945. And for those earlier years, I did not have an answer. And so I think it's really important to remember that Niemöller in that statement was not saying that he was silent about the arrest of socialists, trade unionists, and Jews because he was too timid to speak out. In fact, he was silent because he also kind of disapproved and disliked those groups of people. But later in his life, after the war, he went through a transformation from being a nationalist, anti-democratic, militaristic Protestant elite to being an internationalist, a humanist, a pacifist who was willing to reckon with Germany's past. So perhaps I'll end it there, and hopefully we have some interesting points to discuss further. And I look forward to hearing from our other panelists.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Rebecca. Let's start first with Professor Mary Kay Mulvaney, please.
Hey, and thank you, Rebecca, for so many interesting things to think about. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. So as Scott mentioned, I'm a faculty member at Elmhurst University. I'm getting used to that. I kid about this being my first year at Elmhurst University, but my 20th year at Elmhurst College, now university. And I have had the privilege of working on working with students and faculty and staff colleagues in a number of ways around Holocaust education. I have taken, in the past, we've had students travel overseas during our January term. Some of you are familiar with our calendar, some maybe not. Basically, during the month of January, students can take one course that often involves overseas travel because they just take the one course for 3 or 4 weeks. So I've done some courses that with another founding member of the Holocaust Education Committee at the college. He's now retired at the university. He's now retired from the university, Wally Lagerwey. Some of you may know him. And we took students on such powerful trips, you know, emotionally very draining for all of us to go to those campsites day after day in the bitter cold. Just imagining the horror that people went through. We went, of course, to all the major museums and memorials in cities like Berlin and like the courtroom in Nuremberg, etc. But it really was the students, the impact on the students that was most memorable for me, you know, just seeing them really transformed in terms of how they began to think about their futures, our world's future. I just very recently I heard from a young man who I remember went on the trip just to DC, not even the international ones, which are so impactful, but that, pardon me, he actually went on the last one internationally with us as well. I just remember that, to Germany, Poland, and Israel, which was an amazing experience. But he was back several years and then decided to do some work for underserved youth at Mercy Home in Chicago. He has since gone to law school and is working on social justice advocacy. And he has told me on more than one occasion that it all stems back to his experience on that Holocaust trip. So it's something that I hope we can eventually repeat in the future. But to Rebecca's point, I was thinking so much, oftentimes something like that is not possible for many students for a lot of reasons, or to have a concentrated experience. So I just want to share a couple of other things that have happened at the university. We are interweaving elements of Holocaust education in a lot of our overseas courses as well as our domestic courses. So that interdisciplinary work that Rebecca talked about, I do believe is so important. Another one of our very popular overseas courses is referred to City as Text, where students explore what the personality, if you will, the values, the priorities of cities through close observation, and it's a certain kind of methodology. But so when they go to Berlin or Prague or Paris or Amsterdam, we also make sure that they go to important sites having to do with Holocaust history and have important conversations and reflection around the ethical questions that inevitably arise for them. We've made, even in courses not intentionally at all focused on the Holocaust, courses that we've taught in Paris, or fairly recently I did a course in Morocco with a colleague from the French department, and it was amazing to see some of the correlations there that in the relationship between Morocco and the world and trying to protect some of the Jews during that period. In domestic courses, just last semester, I taught a course with a colleague that I love teaching. It's a bidisciplinary course called Understanding Politics Through Literature. I'm an English professor. I teach it with a political science professor who, so when we talk about threats to democracy through nationalism and to the extreme fascism or other tyrannical forms of government, but when we talk about fascism, then specifically, then we also study a Holocaust memoir as a genre of literature from one perspective I have to take, and then also from the compelling personal story that is often the best way in for students to begin to, I can't really say understand the Holocaust. I don't know that anyone can understand it, but at least to begin to identify with some of the experiences that people had. So we're trying, my point is we're trying to weave it through the curriculum in whatever ways that we can. I can't thank the Holocaust Museum in DC enough for the phenomenal website resources that are available, particularly in this virtual time, all the time, but particularly now when we can't visit in our annual DC visit. But the website materials are amazing, the historical ones, the testimonies from survivors and so on. So not sure how my time is going here. I could talk forever about these experiences. I did want to share just a couple of quotes from student reflections, because another part of something that Rebecca talked about, I wanted to emphasize, is the important reflection. So when we take the DC students to DC or in courses that I've taught overseas, whether specifically focused on Holocaust or not, students keep a daily journal, and we're constantly challenging them to reflect on what they've seen, not just a travel log like I went here and there and had this fun cafe experience, but to really think about what they're learning about another culture. And so some of the reflections that they share when they return or even along the way on a longer trip are amazing. And so that students are thinking of connections to other things, which is in some ways the best we can hope, right? That they don't forget the history, but that they let it impact their decisions as future leaders. One of the students said after the visit, this was to the DC US Memorial Museum, I thought more about the impacts of the Holocaust than when I'd learned about it in school. So when they just read about some of the history and the quote unquote facts, I thought about how some situations today parallel to the leading events or the foreshadowing events maybe of the Holocaust, maybe that 33 and even prior, but 33 to 37 period that Rebecca was just referring to. I think what is powerful about going to the museum is that it really makes you think and makes you question what happened and why it happened. Students talked about the unbelievable impact of hearing from a survivor, and I know it's fewer and fewer of the docents there are survivors or are going to be with us just of natural causes, but some students in past years had some very powerful experiences, and they talked about wanting to never forget what the survivors shared and wanting to learn as much as they could. This is another quote. So I can share my knowledge with others so that one day when Henry, some of you will remember Henry Greenbaum was wonderful at the museum for many years, and all of the survivors are gone, their stories of heroism and courage can impact the lives of others in the future. And there are many quotes. The students are constantly thanking us for the experiences. If and shameless plug here, we need donor money to help support these experiences for students. So I'm just going to put it out there. Those of you that might be in a position to help with Holocaust education, that's part of it, to help support students who can't afford financially to have these experiences. So anyway, those are just some of my thoughts. I wanted to share some of the things that are actually happening on campus or have happened in recent history. And as soon as we can, we'll be back to DC. We had it all set, flights, everything to go there last April, and then COVID hit us, of course, and we had to cancel all our travel. But hopefully, for sure by 22, if not later in 21, we'll see. We'll be back, I should say.
Thank you, Mary Kay. How about if I turn now to our wonderful Michelle Sadowski from the Niebuhr Center.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. And thank you so much too to Rebecca, Scott for hosting. I I had a few things that I want to talk about, but before I do that, I'm inspired by both Rebecca and Mary Kay. I'd like to just share a very, very quick story because as Scott mentioned, I was on that trip, that inaugural trip with the institution to go to Washington, D.C. And something happened to me there in a conversation with one of my classmates, my peers, another Elmhurst student that I don't think I'm ever going to forget. We left the museum day one because it was a 2-day event, so to speak. And after day one, a friend of mine, we're walking around Washington, D.C., just silent. For those of you who have been to the U.S. Museum, there's really not much to say when you walk out. You need to process. There's so much that you need to process. And so we were each processing in our own way, but I could tell that something was a little off with my friend, and I was concerned. And so I asked her, I said, could you share your thoughts? How are you feeling? And I knew that this was going to be impactful for her in a different way than it was for me, because I am not Jewish, but she is Jewish. So she said to me, Michelle, this is actually my 3rd time at the museum. The first time that I went, I was in middle school, and I was struck by the room with the shoes. Those of you who have been there, you know what I'm talking about. For those of you who haven't, there is a space, an exhibition space within the museum with shoes from victims that, pile up from the ground and up along the walls. And, she said, as a little girl, middle school, walking in there, seeing those shoes, I was struck by the enormity of how many there were. And the piles seemed to go, above my waist, almost in the corner, almost to my head. I just couldn't believe how many shoes there were. And that's what hit her from the first time. And when she went back to the museum the second time as a high schooler, she was really excited to go back to that room with the shoes, because that was what had stuck with her. And walking through, she got to that room with the shoes and she thought, there are a lot of shoes here, but not as many as I remember. Maybe it's because this is the second time seeing it. I don't know. Maybe it's because I'm a little older, what have you. I'm still struck by it, but not in the same way. And so she left. Now, this is the 3rd time walking in as a college student, walking out. She goes, Michelle, this is my 3rd time going. And it finally struck me that there were people in those shoes. And she couldn't get that out of her mind, that with every pair of shoes, that she thought of someone's mother, someone's brother, someone's sister, aunt, child, grandchild. And her and I still keep in contact. It's been a while. It's been over 10 years. And we recently, less than a year ago, actually had a conversation about our walk through DC and about her thinking about the people who were in those shoes. And she said, I can't believe you remembered. I said, of course I remember. She goes, oh, I remember too. And I think about that day. Okay. And I think that that's important to keep in mind because, one, for those of us who study the Holocaust, I think, a question we sometimes get asked is, well, how could you study that? And the more and more you go into it, do you become desensitized? Do you put up a wall? No, it's, as I can at least speak for myself and say, going through life and, knock on wood, if I'm blessed with many more years, I expect that as I progress through different points in my life, I'm going to view the Holocaust in different ways, and it's going to connect with me in different ways. It connects with me different now as a mother than it did when I was a student at Elmhurst at 18, 19, 20, 22 when I graduated. Back when I was getting my master's and I was in my mid-20s, it connects with me differently. And so I would, encourage those of you, especially if there are any students on with us, even if, you're sitting here thinking, I've been lucky to this point and that I feel like I've had a course on the Holocaust or I've learned about it here. Okay, great. You do have a foundation and that's wonderful, but keep going. Keep going. Not only because there is so much room and spaces to go, where if it's this angle with the Holocaust, and this is what encourages you, you want to look at, how it ties the intersectionality between the Holocaust and faith. Explore that. If you want to explore the Holocaust and propaganda and marketing and psychology, go with that. Find that niche, okay? But then continue on, because as you grow, I think that the way you process the information will also grow and develop. Okay, and that's something that you know, we talk about in first year seminar. One of the courses that I teach is a first year seminar class in studying the Holocaust through film. And I had difficulty when I created this course. There are so many different lenses to speak to some of your comments, Rebecca, about you know, with what angle the interdisciplinary nature of the Holocaust. How does one sit and create a Holocaust course that is founded in history and fact, but is not a Holocaust history class? That's not what it is. This is supposed to just get folks thinking about those bigger questions, the critical thinking, the reflection. Students do journals. So the idea is that this course is a wonderful springboard into students then taking a course on the Holocaust or going on an experiential trip, whether that be to, you know, the museum in Skokie or to your museum in DC or to Europe. You know, maybe, you know, there's an honors course facing history on ourselves and looking at the Holocaust, but also taking a look at the United States and the eugenics movement and our role, right? So finding that angle and going off of that springboard. So students in our course, I am amazed. I am absolutely amazed at how, you know, this is first year seminar, not first year lecture. We approach different types of film, and they're a complete mix between testimony, documentary, some Hollywood, and oddly enough, the students do prefer the documentary and the testimony to the Hollywood, which you know, I also find fascinating. But they start grappling with those bigger questions. Well, okay, but who am I? And to what do I owe? What's my responsibility to fellow human beings? And those bigger questions of, you know, responsibility and forgiveness, redemption, if that's even possible. So students start thinking about these bigger things, and then they connect them, or I should say they will. Surprise if there are any of my students on this call, this is coming, take note. So at the end of the term, I asked the students to really think about the Holocaust and the liberal arts and the importance of those bigger questions, but let's now put it into focus of you as somebody who's going to be a biology major and you who's going to be a nursing major, right? Let's make this, let's continue to make this personal, because as much as for those of us who study the Holocaust, we do talk about those facts and those numbers and dates, and those are so incredibly important, but it's equally important, if not more important, to remember that this was, you know, one murder done 6 million times over for Jews, and one murder done millions and millions and million times over for other populations as well, that these were lives, these were individual human beings. So that's something that we emphasize and we focus. And my last comment, and then Scott, I'm going to turn it back over, is I decided on doing film also because the nature of how we study the Holocaust is also changing, right? I mean, as you know, as Mary Kay, you stated, you know, we're going to be in a position soon where we don't have Holocaust survivors who can tell us firsthand their testimony, what they experienced, right? So what do we do in that sort of world? And so we're starting to turn collectively toward, you know, film, toward virtual experiences, whether they be virtual interactive films or holographs or what have you. The world is changing. And once one of these technologies is created, you've kind of opened Pandora's box a little bit. You can't put the genie back in the bottle. So there's also these ethical components too, when you look at, you know, testimony and what have you through the means and lens of technology. And that's a whole nother discussion, but it's a discussion that we're going to have. And we're already having, but I think on a larger scale, once we get to the point in the very near future of I can't have a survivor come to my class, whether that be Zoom or in person, right? How are we going to have that individual connection? Thank you. And Scott, I do.
So finally, we need to get to Rabbi Bob, and we're kind of getting into we were going to close at 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock for Rebecca out on the East Coast. So Rabbi, our founding member, please, sir.
As accustomed as I am to public speaking, I will indeed be brief. The we're about to begin a celebration of 150 years of our university. And not surprisingly, this brings us to reflect on what we've done as a university for 150 years and what we want to do in the future. My colleagues who've been speaking have brought strong testimony how we have changed over time. And the things that Mary Kay and Michelle described that we're doing now are not what we were doing 50 years ago. We're a very different school, a very different place than we were 50 years ago. And we have taken, I think, in a very serious way, a strong sense of responsibility to help our students understand we're not just preparing them for professions, we're preparing them to be citizens. And we're helping them grow, and we're helping them acquire wisdom, and we're helping them acquire values. We understand that we were a German college when the college began. And we say this, we weren't sort of a German college, we were a German college. The language spoken on campus was German. I read recently that the students who took Latin and Greek learned to translate Latin and Greek texts, not into English, they learned to translate Latin and Greek texts into German. The Kaiser's birthday was a festive day on campus. We were really a German school for German Americans. Now, we've changed, the times have changed, the makeup of the school has changed dramatically. And we understand that we're preparing our students to live as citizens in our country, to be responsible citizens in our country, and to have a sense of civic responsibility, civic obligation, and to play a positive role in the communities in which they will live, in our community and campus while they're with us, and the communities they're going to live in afterwards. It's no fun to teach about the Holocaust. I would be thrilled to never have to say the word Holocaust again. But we know that we have an obligation to teach our students about that which is most difficult. We can't just do light and frothy things with them. We have to show them and bring them to understand the darkest periods in human history, and to look at why people acted in one way and why people acted in another way. As Scott mentioned earlier on, my father-in-law is a survivor. I know for some people, getting to hear a Holocaust survivor speak is a special occasion. For me, it happens slightly more often. So if anybody wants to take a Holocaust survivor to a doctor's appointment or go grocery shopping for a Holocaust survivor, I can arrange it easily. My father-in-law, he's written memoirs for the family. So he grew up in Germany. He was born in 1926 in Chemnitz, Germany. He experienced the Holocaust step by step. I mean, his first day at school, the Nazis took over the school. He encountered the Nazis when he was a 6-year-old. When he was, on the day that he turned 44, he was arrested at a train station in Germany, and he was taken by the officer who arrested him into the police station in the train station. And the officer there said to the person who arrested him, "Have you done the paperwork?" And the guy said, "No." And the officer said, the chief officer said, "You have to go do the paperwork." The captain said, "You have to go do the paperwork." And he sent the lower ranking officer off to do the paperwork. And this captain turned to my father-in-law and said, "Run." And my father-in-law ran. Now, who was this captain? We have no idea. He had done something that he was able to rise to be an officer, but there was one moment where he acted as a rescuer. Now, what moved him to act in that way? We can speculate. We in the family certainly have speculated many times, but he acted in a certain way when he had a moment. He didn't wake up in the morning saying, "Oh, a Jew may come into my office today." There were no more Jews in Germany in 1944. The occasion happened and he responded. So we want to know, what will we do when we're put in a situation where we have a choice to make? What will our students do when they're in a situation where they have a choice to make? When we study the Holocaust, we learn about people who did awful things, and we want to know why the people did the awful things, or why the people stood by when awful things were done. We also want to know why certain people at certain moments were able to stand up and be what we think people should be. And we're committed to telling all the stories, the awful stories, and these. So we've had we've had rescuers on campus. I once introduced one of the rescuers as a heroine of humanity, and she got mad at me. Our friend Marion, she got mad at me. She said, "I was just well raised. I acted the way my parents taught me to act." Our work is important. We've committed ourselves to this work, and people keep joining us to commit to our work. For those of you who are on this call, I invite you to come and be part of our committee. I recognize some of you, even if I can't see your faces, I can see your names, and I recognize our members of the congregation, members of congregation Etz Chaim. If you would like to come and join our committee, we would like to have you. On our committee, you can be young leadership, even though you're already retired. The two members of the congregation who are currently members of the committee are both on the top side of 90. So we need some people who are younger than 90. So if you're younger than 90 and would like to come join our committee, you're retired, you don't have free time, come and join us. We'd love to have you.
And featuring, and maybe as the future of the committee, but also the future of our work here at the university. Rebecca, any thoughts that help us start a little conversation? We don't have a lot of time, but a little bit of a chance to banter with the colleagues that are here. And then anybody that wants to type something on, please type on the chat section. Michelle's watching because I'm a dinosaur. I don't know how to do that stuff.
I know we don't have a lot of time left, so I'm happy to just go to any questions or, I've already said my piece, so.
Thank you so much. Mary Kay, anybody?
No, I was just going to invite people to also just unmute and, speak up, ask a question or comment. What's going through your mind? I'm always wondering how people are receiving any of these thoughts. We'd love to hear your perspective.
Well, perhaps an interesting direction to go is speaking more about the transformation of your student body. Hearing it's so fascinating, the German roots of your school, and I think for any undergraduate liberal arts college in America, the student body has changed dramatically over the century, and even in the past, since I was an undergrad. So with it, the way that we approach the subject matter has changed too. So I don't know, perhaps those of you who are teaching students right now have some insights about how things have changed, maybe even in the last 5 years. The new generation of students who weren't even alive for 9/11, right? Like 21st century students.
Yeah. And Rebecca, oh, I'm so sorry.
Go ahead, Michelle.
We actually do have a question that came in. So for you, Rebecca, or anyone else on the panel, is there a book recommendation that you have for learning about religious literacy?
And while you're thinking about a response to that, you all, Mladen Turk on our faculty in religious studies works with the AAR quite closely. And we've also had Rabbi Rachel Mikva, who gave the Heschel lecture a number of years ago, wrote a very commanding, and it's just out, book on dangerous religious ideas. She is the backbone of the religious interfaith and religious literacy of the AAR. But there are a number of books. What comments would some of you like to offer for that, maybe?
It's hard to recommend a book without knowing who the person who's asking the question is. For Jews, at Passover, we gather for a Passover Seder. And we talk about 4 kinds of children, and there's 4 kinds of adults as well. There's people who are looking for really sophisticated answers, and people who are beginners. And we want to give the right recommendation to the person asking the right question.
I would say that that's a fantastic point, Rabbi. And I believe that the person asking is probably coming at this from a novice perspective, someone who's looking for a place to start.
Yes, maybe I'll jump in. Oh, I should show my video here, but see, I'm as bad as, here we go. Here we are. Hi, hello. I was thinking of, in this polarized society that we find ourselves in, especially today, and how do you, personally, also certainly in my own naive way as a novice to learn about this, but also how to begin those conversations with students, with young people, to express a need for developing religious literacy. So those were my thoughts.
And Rebecca did put in the chat the link for the guide that she mentioned, or the group of resources on religious literacy, right? So it would be some things to choose from, I think. I think one of the things for introducing it to students is understanding how much, when we talk about religious literacy, at least as I would understand that term or phrase, religion is an extremely important part of culture and history. And it's not about a specific religion. It's about, ways to conceive of the human experience with some sort of spiritual element, faith connection that people for centuries have defined in very different ways, but they're really crucial to their identities and their interactions, and having some understanding historically as well as in contemporary context. One of the things that's been going through my mind is the diversity of our student body today, for instance. While there still is a university affiliation with the UCC tradition, the majority of the people on our campus, myself included, actually, are not of that tradition, and there's a lot of variety. We have a growing number of Muslim students, and are enriched by learning about Islam and its connections with Christianity, and then their understanding of Judaism, and this sort of interfaith connection, I think, is increasingly important. And I have to give a shout out to Scott, because he does a phenomenal job trying to educate all of us coming from different traditions, about reaching out and understanding people's traditions.
If people are looking for something to read, lots of people have enjoyed Karen Armstrong's books.
Right.
So that I would encourage people, particularly people who are on the call today, might want to look at what Karen Armstrong has done, and that might be a good entree point for today's participants, not necessarily for the students, but for the people who are with us this afternoon.
Karen is also up at Harvard with the Pluralism Project, Dana, and that's a very important whole website. It's called the Pluralism Project. It's out of Harvard, and it's a great entry into a lot of this discourse.
If anybody wants to read and discuss about any religion, I'm happy to do so with them. Not the real course, just a book group of 2 people is fine too.
And I'd like to point out a comment from Elaine in the chat that to give you credit, Scott, for raising a very good point, that there are those who are spiritual but not necessarily religious may need more convincing that understanding religions is still very important today.
Here, I just reminded of the work of religion scholar Orrin Steer in Florida, and he's written a really fascinating article on the way that the Holocaust Museum actually has dealt with displaying the desecrated Torah scrolls. And this is, a nod to Kristallnacht, and the reason we're meeting today is a portion of the permanent exhibition about Kristallnacht, and they display desecrated Torah scrolls. And he talks about the decisions that the curators went through for how to display those in a way that is sensitive to the Jewish traditions, and the ways that we can, in order to understand that and appreciate that as a museum visitor, you have to know what a Torah scroll is and a little bit about Jewish law, in order to even comprehend. So maybe that is something that would be an interesting entry point for students. Maybe not the article itself, because it's an academic article, but the experience of confronting something in a museum and needing a bit more understanding.
We have another great set of questions from one of our students. Thank you. And we can look at that. It is 5:01, and I'm willing to keep going for a few more minutes. Rebecca, I know you've got other responsibilities. It's 6 o'clock on the East Coast, so
I'm good.
Knocking on your door saying, "Come out, come out."
Well, no, my family knows I have a shut door. I'm good for a few more minutes.
A few more minutes, please. We're so thankful for all of you who are not a part of the committee and the team here. Rebecca, your willingness to jump on like this, and for all of you that are writing, typing questions. I'll push Rabbi Bob's great comment, and I'm going to put my email in. If you want to join the committee, we need you. It's a team that meets, we're actually meeting Thursday at 3 o'clock on Zoom to talk about next year, the 150th, very specific, next year. Although I'm going to bring up the fact that Father John Polakowski gave a great presentation yesterday in Naples on what Catholic faith is doing in relationship. And because we have such a large Catholic community here, it would be really helpful for us to maybe bring Father John by Zoom, not for a lecture, but a conversation. But my email's down below. If you would like to join, we would love to have you. Other comments though, please.
You know, we have a student who's asking for book recommendations that focus more on the psychology and sociology that build up to the events of the Holocaust, which is honestly a very interesting angle, because what you tend to see is more of not necessarily the opposite, but it's more of a chronology of, you know, of events of what leads up to the Holocaust, and then looking at the actions therein, you know, from the time about when Hitler comes to power to, you know, slightly after the Holocaust, right, ends. And that's even a debate at the end of the Holocaust, of when exactly do you pinpoint that, and looking at it collectively from a sociological or psychological perspective, but looking at really those events leading up. So I'm assuming, you know, I believe it was Taylor, I think we're asking Taylor, you know, if you're looking for, I just want to clarify then, you're looking for more of, you know, books that explain the lead up to. So, you know, after World War I and the Weimar Republic, and then the Nazis coming to power in 1933. I just want to verify that that's what you're looking for. Are you looking for books that are more on the psychology and sociology, or kind of both? Taylor wouldn't mind chiming in. Then folks, I think we could definitely give you some recommendations there.
It might be helpful. Are you coming in, Taylor?
I'm kind of looking for books that kind of talk about the mentalities that went into the Holocaust, because I think a lot of people just approach it from like, there's all this stuff that happened and how did it happen and why did it. I'm one of those people who gets fixated on like what built up to this, why did this happen. And if there are books that talk about the mentalities and like the psychological perspective, I was just curious.
Sure. I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is you know, so this is a funny thing for an academic to say, but it's not just books. There are other things you don't have to find just books. There are excellent resources, you know, to delve into this with primary sources, actually, or people's accounts. If you're looking to understand sort of how a functioning democracy crumbled in a very short amount of time, there are plenty of resources, and I can point you to some things on the Holocaust Museum's website, some of those tools for students, if you're trying to understand sort of that transformation of German society in the 1920s and early 30s.
And Elaine in our library has put up a note also that's really wonderful about the resources in the college university's library. I also put up, we're bringing Dr. Stephen Ray, the president of Chicago Theological Seminary. He was to be with us last year. He's coming this year in April for our Yom HaShoah service in April. His area of expertise is on Jim Crow US laws and how those were then used by the Nazi legal system to build Nuremberg and the structures that built the whole system. It's a fascinating piece that takes psychological and the sociological understandings of the United States as a base for the building of Nazi Germany. Very difficult, but it's really critical. And he's an amazing person.
I give one more recommendation. I stuck it in the chat. Oh goodness, now it's flying out of my mind. I could probably just look. Yes,
Becoming Evil is
Understanding
very good.
Genocide. Understanding Genocide. Yeah, the social psychology of the Holocaust. So trying to, as best we can, understand how, seemingly, normal everyday folk can get wrapped up and actually become active participants in genocide. What makes someone choose to take action and resist or to rescue, as opposed to others being passive, because even being passive, is a conscious choice. So I would highly recommend that book. It's a good place to start.
Friends, it is a little after 6 o'clock on the East Coast. I'm sounding a little bit like a commentator that's been going on television, and a lot of us have been listening to that for a lot lately. But will you join me first in thanking Rebecca, Michelle, Mary Kay, and Rabbi Bob, please, for all of your help. Thank you so very much. For all of you that joined, please, thank you. And my email's there if you want to follow up with questions or join our committee. And stay tuned and take care of yourself, because we're in a rough time right now. There's a run to Thanksgiving. Finals are waiting. Got to take care of your bodies, your health, your mind, your soul, your spirit. The blessings to all of you. Thank you so very much. We'll look forward to our next step together. Rebecca, thank you again, too.
You're very welcome. It was a pleasure.
Take
Thank
care,
you,
everyone.
everyone.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
evening. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.